Welcome and thank you for stopping by Sheila's Audiobooks, and I am Sheila. This recording is coming from South Texas. All stories on this recording are in the public domain per United States copyright law. These stories were first published around April 1910. They are about Lord Lister called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant among all thieves. He is the terror of usurers and moneylenders, robs them of their possessions by his wiles, protecting beleaguered innocence and supporting the needy. Man of honor in all respects. He persuaded that many abuses, protected by law, continue to proliferate with impunity. Every effort is made to apprehend Lord Lister, called John C. Raffles, the most brilliant of thieves. Reward, £1,000 sterling.
Lord Lister, the Great Unknown. By Kurt Matchell and Theo Blakenzy. Chapter 1. It was about 6 o'clock in the afternoon when the wealthy silk importer Lucas Brown ordered his first accountant to close the business. The windows of the building on the Strand in London faced this broad thoroughfare, and Mr. Brown could see the bustling bustle of the giant city through the lowered blinds. Before his bookkeeper left the private office, Mr. Brown to him. "Send the new officer, Miss Walton, to me. I need to speak to her." The bookkeeper bowed, trying to hide an ironic smile. He knew his superior and what such an interview meant. Mr. Brown, on principle, employed only young, inexperienced girls whose appearance pleased him. "Are you satisfied with Miss Walton's work?" he asked the bookkeeper. "Certainly," replied the latter, "she is doing her duty well." So, said Mr. Brown, rubbing his fleshy hands, "I'm glad to hear that. She is an extremely beautiful girl. That girl, if I care about her fate, can have a good future." Again the bookkeeper bowed to hide a smile. As he was about to leave the room, the street shouted the shouts of newspaper boys, who offered the latest evening papers, and who echoed in a loud voice the succinct contents of the latest important news which the newspaper contained. "A new land of Raffles," they shouted. "Raffles, the great unknown, stole 250,000 jewels. Raffles is untraceable." Mr. Brown saw the passers-by literally fighting over the newspapers. "Get me an evening paper," he ordered his accountant. "That's a funny story with this Raffles." The bookkeeper disappeared, and after a few minutes returned with the requested paper, which announced Raffles' last deed in large letters. Hastily read, Mr. Brown ran through the article and then spoke to his accountant. "An extraordinary man. Such a guy has never existed. He has been occupying our entire police force with great cunning for weeks now. No trace of the man has yet been found. Sherlock Holmes seems to want to retire from public life, and without them our so famous police force is an old whack." "Yes," replied the bookkeeper, "that Raffles is a genius. And I must confess that I respect him. He must have an extraordinary talent, that king of burglars. A true Napoleon. And for the rest undeniably a gentleman." "I believe you are mad, my dear. All of London seems to be affected by Raffles fever. Wherever one goes, one hears talk of that aristocratic thief." Mr. Brown curled his plump lips in contempt. "You seem to have a peculiar conception of a gentleman." "Not at all, Mr. Brown," replied the bookkeeper. "It is a fact that this unknown burglar uses the stolen goods only to render benefits to the poor of Whitechapel or East End." "The fellow is mad," said Mr. Brown, "crazy. He acted more wisely when he used the stolen goods for better purposes. If only for wine, women and wealth. That mob in Whitechapel and East End wouldn't be worth a penny to me." "That's why Raffles takes care of that," smiled the bookkeeper. "Instead of the penny, which you do not give to the poor, he takes notes from your pocket. That helps better." Brown frowned angrily and replied in an insulting tone. "You dare say much, Mr. Thomas. Keep your comments to yourself. If you hadn't been with me for so many years, I should blame you very much. But, Let us not quarrel over this, Raffles. The main thing is that he leaves us undisturbed. Let's hope for the best. Nor do I believe that you have enough to receive a visit from Raffles, continued the bookkeeper. What? Cried Mr. Brown. Do I not have enough? Sir, I am a millionaire. I am purveyor to the royal household. So much the better for Raffles if he comes. Be silent. You make me nervous. The bookkeeper said with a laugh. It would be very pleasant to me if he invisibly helped me with some banknotes, though they didn't come out of your coffers, Mr. Brown. He raised his short, broad frame and exclaimed furiously. Keep your bland niceties to yourself at last. You are capable of totally spoiling someone's mood. May the devil fetch that Raffles. I've been sleeping so restlessly ever since that fellow came on the scene. Every night I dream that he has plundered my safe. I don't want to hear any more about him. But now call Miss Walton. The bookkeeper left the room as Brown walked over to the safe that stood next to the writing desk and examined the shiny bolts and locks. It would make you nervous, he muttered. You would start to think that Raffles was in a locked safe. Again he tried the different bolts. He put the letter lock on another secret word and noted this. When he was done with this, Miss Walton came in. She was a young girl, very modestly dressed, but with a very lovely and delicate face. She paused hesitantly on the threshold. Come a little closer, my dear, laughed Brown, and his small eyes scanned her figure. He approached her, grasped with his fleshy, heavy-bearded fingers her slender hand and led the young girl to a Turkish chair. This intimacy impressed Miss Walton as if some ghastly spider was crawling over her, and an inexplicable terror seized her. Brown sat down in a chair next to hers, took her hand again and stroked it, looking tenderly at the girl. Miss Walton turned blood red in the face. What beautiful hands you have! Those little fingers are too delicate to do the rough desk work, they are fit only to hold up silk skirts and be adorned with diamonds. The young girl was too inexperienced to comprehend what her superior meant, and though the unpleasant feeling persisted, she dared not withdraw her hand. She thought that the 50-year-old man approached her with paternal goodwill. The latter, for his part, thought that she was resting her hand in his as a sign of rapprochement, and bending over, he kissed her fingers. The girl started back. Her feminine instinct suddenly told her what danger she was in now. Hastily she got up and said, It's late, Mr. Brown. You must excuse me, my sick mother, who is waiting at home, would be alarmed if I were gone too long. I have to go now. It is not so late, replied her chief, and your mother will have excellent nursing and all that she desires, if you will be a little kind to me. Miss Walton looked wide-eyed at the chief, who rose and approached her again to take her hand again. But she pushed him back. Let me. I have to go. Not so soon, little one. You can chat with me for another hour and then you'll be home early enough. He wanted to embrace her, but she drew aside. Let me go, or I cry for help. Oh, whoa, you are a little cat, but your calling would be in vain, for we are alone in the building. Miss Walton looked around anxiously for a way out. There she saw, through one of the windows, a slenderly built young man who bought the evening paper from a newspaper boy. In an instant the girl had rushed to the window and opened it. Please help me. They insult me. The man turned around in surprise. The girl looked into a pair of large black eyes for a moment, and saw a dark, sun-tanned face. The stranger bowed. I'll come immediately. Miss Walton took a deep breath. Brown stood in the middle of the room, his face twisted with anger, and cried with clenched fists. Fool! I'll make you pay for that. But at the same moment the stranger also entered. What do you want in my office? Get out at once or I'll call a policeman, shouted the merchant. Without deigning an answer, the stranger turned to Miss Walton. How may I serve you? I heard they make it difficult for you. Take me out of this house. That man there insults me. The stranger immediately understood what had happened. He spoke to him in a contemptuous tone. Mirror. Go away. repeated the addressee. The stranger turned and said to Miss Walton, "Follow me, please." The young girl nodded gratefully and left the room with him. "You are fired," the chief called after her. Her rescuer smiled and Miss Walton led her outside, where she bid him farewell with a few words of thanks. "It might be of some use if I knew your address," asked the young man. Miss Walton immediately handed him her calling card. Then he bowed to goodbye. The young girl hastened home and thus did not see the stranger return to the office and close the outer door behind him. The intruder listened for seconds. Then he took a black mask from the pocket and crept through the various rooms to Brown's study. This one just wanted to leave. He had already forgotten the whole incident and softly whistled a melody from Die Lustige Witwe. Suddenly he stopped, as if paralyzed, for suddenly in front of him stood a masked person, who held out the barrel of a revolver before him. "I'd like to meet you," said a threatening voice. The merchant could not utter a word. His knees trembled, it grew black before his eyes. "Follow me," ordered the masked one. Willlessly, Brown obeyed. The two went to a room at the back of the building, the officers' dressing room. The masked man opened a large wardrobe and bade Brown enter. "Your wallet, sir," he snapped at the merchant, and he obeyed, glad to get off so easily. "I don't have time for your safe now, I'll get to that next time." The closet door closed and the stranger left the room. When he got back to the office, he opened the wallet and took out several notes. Then he looked for some envelopes, printed with the name of the firm, and put a banknote in each. At the writing desk of Mr. Brown wrote on each envelope, "For your benefit, you send this. John Raffles." He laughed softly and closed the envelope with a seal, which showed a crowned skull. Thereupon he laid the letters on the desks of the officials. Of the rest of the wallet he was only interested in a single letter written by a certain Oxford Street banker James Gordon to Mr. Brown addressed and read, "My dear Mr. Brown, our latest business has turned in a brilliant profit. The bills we got from Dr. Walter were finally paid by him after I threatened him with the court. I have credited you with £200. Send me something like that very soon. Such a thing is worth it. Best regards, yours, James Gordon." "I must get to know this man," muttered Raffles. He put the letter in his pocket and left the office. He heard the knocking and screaming of the imprisoned merchant, laughed heartily at it, and disappeared among the crowd. Out there, the paper boys were still peddling their papers, which covered Raffles' last act. They did not suspect that a still later prank had already been committed. Chapter 2. A Rogue Banker. In his small office on Oxford Street in London sat the banker James Gordon, counting large sums of money, which he divided into various currencies, wrapped in rolls and deposited in his safe. He was a small, disfigured person, with a pock-marked face, which clearly bore the marks of stinginess. The banker had just closed his safe when there was a modest knock at the door. In a hoarse voice he cried, "Come in." And an old woman of about 50 years of age entered modestly and hesitantly. She surveyed the desk. "What do you want?" he asked in a curt tone. "Excuse me," stammered the woman, "my name is Annie Walton, and I read in an advertisement that you are borrowing money." "Certainly, that's my business. Do you want money?" "Yes, I am very embarrassed. My husband died last year and my daughter is unemployed." "Have you secured?" "Ah, sir," replied the old woman, in a trembling tone, and tears filled her eyes, "I have only a few little things left, but that won't be a surety for you." Banker Gordon let out a low whistle, then laughed cheekily. "Do you think I'm mad? Then all London might come, all Whitechapel and East End, to borrow money from me. Pooh! Ha ha!" The woman looked at him with a frightened face. "Sir," she begged, "I am very ill and have dragged myself here to get help." "Better stay at home and don't hold me up," replied the banker, harshly. "But what am I supposed to do then? I don't know what to do anymore, and give you my word, mister, that I will work day and night, as soon as I'm better to pay you back the loan. Then I'll have to wait a long time, said the banker in a dry tone. That's what you all say when you're hungry. I can do that. But you have a daughter, as you say. Then send it to Piccadilly Street by night, or, if she isn't pretty enough for that, send her to Whitechapel, to earn her living on the street. The old woman paled when she heard the names of those London quarters where only the demimonde and the criminals practiced their craft. Never! She exclaimed. You have no children, sir, otherwise you would not speak like that. It is very sinful of you. Banker Gordon shrugged contemptuously. Go now, I can no longer hear your wails, I have work to do. The woman staggered toward the door with difficulty. At the same moment a young, elegant man entered and took the old woman by the arm. Stay here, Miss Walton. By chance, as the door was not quite closed, I overheard the conversation that was going on here. I hope I can help you. The woman followed him hesitantly and went back into the room. Banker Gordon had risen and faced the intruder, who was elegantly dressed. The stranger, for his part, took off his pearl-grey gloves with indifference, took his monocle out of his right eye and lit a cigarette. He had not removed the top hat, as a special expression of indifference. He could be about 30 years old, his countenance had a proud, self-assured expression, and his eyes glittered presumptuously, looking down with determination at Banker Gordon. This one had become very nervous, he did not know what to do with that intruder. Judging by the precious diamonds which the gentleman wore on his hands, this person did not come to borrow money. As the stranger made no move to speak, but with a mocking laugh blew the smoke of his cigarette in the banker's face, James Gordon at length inquired. How may I serve you? By many, replied the stranger, I got your address last night during a short visit to Mr. Brown. It is a great pleasure for me to meet you. When the banker heard the name of his merchant friend, his face brightened. He bowed courteously, made an inviting motion with his hand to take his seat, and said, With whom do I have the honor? The stranger looked at him and after a while answered, My name will be known to you. My name is, he paused a moment, then spoke in a slow, measured tone, John C. Raffles. As if stung by a viper, Banker Gordon jumped from his chair and felt with his right hand for a revolver hidden under a pile of papers. You are Raffles? He asked, stuttering with fear. Raffles, who's that? Exactly, interrupted the gentleman to the trembling banker, the same one you mean. I am Raffles, the great unknown, the arch-thief, who makes a sport of tracking down inhuman ruffians and trying them with the robbery, whom he extorts from you leeches and usurers, to make amends for that which you have sinned. But first, he turned to Mrs. Walton, sitting in silence. How much money do you need, my dear lady? £50, perhaps? No, stuttered this one, with £5 I would have helped. I know your daughter, madam, said Raffles, and chance has come to my aid, but now let's talk business. He turned to Gordon. Pay that woman £5. The banker was about to answer, but the fear of the unknown paralyzed his tongue, and trembling he went to the safe. He put a £5 note on the table. That's for you, said Raffles to the woman, the banker will gladly give it to you. It is the most decent business he ever had at hand, for he gives you the money without interest and lets you keep it until you get well again. He is a good man, this Banker Gordon, and now you must go and leave me alone with my lord. With kind thanksgiving, the unhappy woman left the room. No sooner had she closed the door behind her than Raffles changed his tone. I am really glad to finally know the vilest usurer in all London. Now I command you, at these words he drew a revolver from his fur coat, sit on that chair by the hearth and tarry there. Sit quietly, as if you were in church. With trembling knees the banker made his way to his appointed place. Without daring to move, he saw John Raffles open the safe and take from it a large bundle of bills, which the usurer had obtained from the poor unfortunates, and how he stowed it away in his yellow handbag. The banker made a sound like a tied wild animal. Raffles looked at him with a mocking smile and said, What do you say? Do you regret that I free you from this burden of sin? You should rather be thankful to me, my dear, that I am finally making you a decent person again. And for the rest, if you want anything from me, you can turn to the police. But he laughed again, lit a cigarette, closed his bag, and continued. I don't think you like to come into contact with the police, because they might want to inspect your books, and that might cost you your freedom. They would probably put you behind bars for a few years. That would be very useful, not only for yourself, but also for society, which would then be freed for some time from such a disgraceful insect. In any case, I will do my duty in this, and have the pleasure of alerting the police, as I am always accustomed to. Fear and hatred were evident on the banker's face. You shall not warn the police, he whispered in a hoarse voice. What use could you have of that? I told you so, replied John Raffles, the pleasure of ridding society of you. The banker threw himself on his knees, raised his hands begging and moaned for mercy. But the other did not relent. He looked at the supplicant with a look of horror, and said in a contemptuous tone, You are as cowardly as any scoundrel. But I am without mercy, as you have been to the unfortunate, who have certainly often begged for pity here. Thereupon John Raffles took one of the usurer's books, took up the heavy folio with both hands, and, lowering it with a mighty blow upon the banker's head, said, Here's a little souvenir. Gordon had collapsed unconscious from the impact. John Raffles looked at him for a few seconds and then took from his pocket a small flask containing an anesthetic fluid, put a few drops of this on a banker's handkerchief, and pressed it to the face of the unconscious. He said softly to himself, He must lie down until the police come. He then picked up the cash book and his bag with the bills of exchange and debentures and left the office. Carefully he locked the door from the outside with a key and gave it to an elevator boy, saying to him, Mr. Gordon has gone out for a few hours, he begged me to give you this key. All right, replied the boy, holding the key to him. John Raffles then left the house. Chapter 3. Scotland Yard Scare. Police Inspector Baxter of the Secret Service sat in his study, which was in Scotland Yard, the terror of all the criminals. He stood at the telegraph machine next to his desk and read with great intent the secret messages sent to him from the various police stations. The inspector nervously let the narrow, endless strip of paper slip through his fingers. Suddenly his eyes widened. As if he saw a ghost, he looked at the just arriving telegram. His face turned pale, he gave a cry of surprise and anger, then sprang to his desk, hastily pressed an electric button, and after a few seconds several secret officers of his division rushed into the room. What happened? Exclaimed Detective Tyler, a tall, broad-shouldered fellow. A ghost. It's beyond crazy. Exclaimed the inspector excitedly. There I receive an enigmatic telegram sent by John Raffles, the fellow who seems to be protected by the devil himself. He has managed to establish a connection to our secret cable. That man seems to be in contact with supernatural powers. Now we have no more secret conduit. He is now able to check our mutual telegrams. That is Raffles' maddest trick, gentlemen. Convince yourself. Curious, the officers crowded around Inspector Baxter and stared at the slip of paper from the Morse code which read, Inspector of Police Baxter, Scotland Yard. Allow me to inform you as briefly as possible, by this way, that in the next 24 hours I shall plunder Lord Edward Lister's safe. I shall take the liberty of always informing you of my plans in this way from now on. Best regards to you and Scotland Yard. Raffles. Raffles. The officers repeated. Yes, gentlemen, cried Baxter, this John Raffles is putting me in a lunatic asylum. I can think of nothing more than Raffles. The newspapers at home and abroad mock us. The brutality of the unknown thief transcends all limits. Henceforth he will even announce to us what crimes he intends to commit. He wants to make it easy for you, Inspector, he is a very polite man. Thought Detective Mahome, whom the London criminals called the cockroach. He smiled mockingly, making his boss even more furious. Inspector Baxter banged his fist on the writing table and cried with an angry countenance, You are amusing yourself in a strange way, Detective Mahome. I do not deny, replied the latter, that this story delights me, and I respect that man. You need have no respect for him. I'll bet my head I catch him this time. What did Sherlock Holmes say to you? Asked Tyler. The English police officer's face took on an expression of displeasure at the mention of the name of his world-famous colleague. Here lies a letter from Mr. Holmes on this matter, and he writes to me that he finds this man's crimes so amusing that he does not want to disturb him in his work, and so must thank Scotland Yard for lend a helping hand. That is, said Tyler, that Sherlock Holmes makes fun of Scotland Yard, and wants to show us how little we can do without him. The papers have made the same conclusion, said Detective Mahome. Sherlock Holmes has deprived us of our good reputation because of his world fame. This John Raffles is driving me crazy, Inspector Baxter repeated sadly. All London is having a good time. What might the villain look like? At this moment the telephone rang. Tyler went to the unit while the others waited in silence. Suddenly the tall, broad-shouldered man began to tremble, all the color left his face, and his right hand settled on the writing table. His colleagues looked at him in surprise. "What is it, Tyler?" asked Baxter. The latter beckoned him to silence, then he cried in a nervous tone, "Yes." Into the microphone, put the receiver on the phone, and spoke hurriedly. "We must at once go to the banker James Gordon's office in Oxford Street. The banker lies there unconscious by the hearth. £3,865 was stolen from the safe." "Who gave the message?" asked Baxter, immediately preparing to go. "Who?" repeated Tyler, taking a deep breath. "The criminal himself." "For the devil." It sounded in unison through the room. "And the burglar sends you, Inspector Baxter, his best regards," continued Tyler, "and he lets you know that his name is John Raffles." A breathless silence followed, but after a few seconds Baxter exclaimed, "Forward, lad. Every second is precious. That man is driving me insane." A few minutes later a car flew out of the great gate of Scotland Yard. Inside were Inspector Baxter and 4 of Scotland Yard's handiest officers. The target was Oxford Street, James Gordon's office. In 15 minutes they had reached the house, a large building that contained many offices. The doorman took the police officers in the elevator to James Gordon's office, which was located on the 4th floor. The door was closed. In a doorway was a business card, which Baxter pulled out. He read, "The key to the office has Jim, the elevator boy." This was taken immediately. He said, taking the key from his trouser pocket, that a gentleman had given it to him to hand over to Mr. Gordon if he asked for it. He had received £1 for it. "What did that gentleman look like?" asked Baxter. "He was as tall as you," replied the lift boy, "and wore a big black beard, a brown coat, a brown hat." He stuttered quite badly. "What color were his eyes?" "I do not know. That gentleman was wearing dark-colored glasses." Detective Mahome laughed loudly. "Let us not waste unnecessarily time," urged Tyler. Baxter closed the door and the gentleman entered the office. Everything looked as it had been communicated to them by telephone. Before the little chimney lay the old 70-year-old banker with his eyes closed. A sweet smell of chloroform filled the room. Thanks to the efforts of the policeman, it was possible to revive the unconscious. Scarcely had he recovered to the extent of being able to speak, when he sprang up. "What do you want here?" This question came so unexpectedly that the detectives looked at the banker in astonishment. "You have been robbed," said Baxter, pointing to the open safe. The banker made an indifferent wave of his hand and asked, "Who are you?" Baxter and his men thought the banker was still under the influence of the chloroform, and Detective Mahome spoke to Baxter. "Leave the banker alone for a few more minutes, that he may regain his memory." A dark red glow flew over Gordon's pointed bird face. In a sharp voice he now asked, "I ask you again what you have to do here in my office. Do you wish to do business with me?" Baxter opened his overcoat and showed his badge. "We are police officers and have been informed that you have been robbed." "Who told you that?" "The burglar himself," replied Baxter. "You are mad," exclaimed Gordon. "You are mad. I know better than you do what has happened." The detectives didn't understand. "Do you want to fool us?" Baxter asked angrily. The banker raised his disfigured figure, pointed to the door, and snapped. "If you don't leave my office at once, I'll call for help from the neighboring police station. You have no business here. I don't need you. Go." The detectives, completely taken aback, went to the door. Then Baxter turned again and said, "Remember what thou dost, sir. Thou hast been ambushed and robbed. They have stolen £3,865 from you. Mind your own business and not mine," the banker bellowed, purplish red with anger. "I repeat, I did not call you, and now for the last time, I beg you to leave my office." The officers had to obey this order. When they were outside again, they looked at each other, as if doubting their own sanity. An evil, sneering laugh rang out from Gordon's office. "Nothing like that has passed me in all my life," said Baxter at last to Tyler, "but I think I'll explain the matter. The man has been robbed, the burglar himself tells us, we find everything as he describes it to us, and the robbed shows us the door." An errand boy came running at this moment and called aloud the name of Inspector Baxter. "Here," replied the latter, "that is me." The boy handed him a place setting with the name of Inspector Baxter written in large letters at the address of Banker Gordon, Oxford Street. The inspector hastily tore open the cover, revealing a small note and a £10 note. "For your meddling in my latest burglary I am sending you £10, and I hope you will spend this amount for a good breakfast. Raffles." In impotent rage Baxter tore up the note, ashamed to tell his officers anything of its contents. "Now let's ride to Lord Lister," he said to the detectives. "If we have to get all Scotland Yard going, this fellow must be caught. He need not believe that he is in communion with the devil." Baxter did not see the smiling face of the cockroach. Detective Mahone was enjoying himself as never before. Chapter 4. A Friend of the Wrong. In the vestibule of Lord Lister's small stately mansion, in Regent Park, a great multitude of people of various ranks and ages had gathered towards the evening of the same day. All had a telegram in their hands and spoke in a whisper of the curious content of these dispatches, which all contained the same text. "Come to me at once, in order to conduct your business satisfactorily with Banker Gordon. Lord Lister, Regent Street 2. A door was opened. A slender young man of about 30 years of age entered the spacious vestibule from one of the inner rooms of the house. It was Lord Lister, followed by his junior private secretary, carrying a stuffed leather wallet. Those present looked inquisitively at the young lord, and especially the women who were there, at once felt the greatest sympathy for him. A regular, beautifully built figure, and a fresh countenance, on which were expressed pride and generosity at the same time. With a benevolent look from his large black eyes he looked at those present, and in his melodious voice he said, "I received this wallet this afternoon from the banker Gordon, with a request to discharge the obligations which he owes you." There was a pause. Then an old man in whom the former officer was recognized, Lord Lister, approached, and replied, "You probably allow yourself a joke. Banker Gordon has no obligation to us. Unfortunately the opposite is true." "God curse this meanest usurer in all London," exclaimed a woman, and a third spoke aloud. "I curse the hour when the necessity of saving my family drove me into the clutches of that leech, and so have all who came in contact with him have gone." With loud shouts, those present expressed their approval. Lord Lister looked at them in silence. Most had traces of care and sorrow on their faces. A fine smile appeared on the nobleman's lips as he spoke. "Like all of you, I know the reputation of this usurer. Unfortunately, the law is unable to punish such people. They are, however, far greater criminals than those who are shut up in prisons, for they know how to carry on their shameful business under the protection of the law. Therefore also I repeat to you, that Banker Gordon has obligations to all of you, which I will put an end to today. Here, my friends, I hand you all the bills of exchange and debentures which you have signed with your heart's blood and peace of mind. God keep you from falling into the hands of such a villain again in the future. Open the wallet, Charlie. As in a dream, the unfortunates stood before the young lord. It seemed so incomprehensible to them, like a miracle from above. Hesitantly they received the papers, they examined the signatures carefully, as if they doubted their authenticity. But no error was possible, all got back their bills and bills that they had once given the leech. A sense of infinite gratitude to their unknown benefactor Lord Lister overcame them. But when they came to shake hands with him with tears of gratitude in his eyes, he was gone. Only his secretary still stood in the same place and bade them go home. Slowly the vestibule emptied, and soon great tranquillity reigned in the small villa. By the fireplace in his study, Lord Lister sat in a comfortable armchair, smoking his never-missing cigarette. His finely carved face, usually of a grave, melancholy expression, gazed thoughtfully into the flames. Near him sat his private secretary and friend Charlie Brand. The study was simple, but distinguished and elegantly furnished. A wide sliding door led to the bedroom. To the left of this door stood an old Dutch clock more than a man's height, while to the right was a safe. A servant entered and with a deep bow handed Lord Lister the evening papers. Already the first page, which the Lord turned, bore the inscription in bold letters. Raffles at work. Scotland Yard tricked. The latest act of the professional thief. A London banker who doesn't want to know that he's been robbed. Lord Lister laughed softly and, after looking through the messages, handed over the papers to his friend. While Charlie Brand read the sensational news, the nobleman studied his friend's face with keen attention. He saw how it faded. The Lord lit another cigarette. When he had taken a few puffs, Charlie Brand spoke. "Edward, what relationship do you have with the banker Gordon?" Lord Lister laughed again, then threw the ashes of his cigarette into the fire, shrugged his shoulders indifferently, and replied. "I? In any relationship? How do you mean that?" "Yes, did you read, Edward, that man this afternoon been robbed? And he himself denies it. I've never heard anything so mysterious. If I were Sherlock Holmes I would have solved that riddle very soon," replied Lord Lister. "How?" Charlie Brand looked at his friend in intense attention. "Very simply," he said, "the robbed man has no doubt plenty of reasons not to want to come into contact with the police." "You would have been an excellent detective." "Certainly," agreed the Lord. "A year ago, when my ordinary life was beginning to bore me, I considered whether I should not work with Sherlock Holmes. After careful consideration, however, I came to the conclusion that it must be much more interesting to be the game instead of the hunter, or rather, instead of being a detective, be a criminal. Don't get me wrong, Charlie, I'm only considering the matter from a sports point of view. Such a criminal must have the double portion of energy, cleverness, and such qualities as the detective. He stands alone in the face of the masses. When one hears you speak, Edward, one would believe that you are much interested in that unknown Raffles. Oh yes, Raffles is not a criminal in the ordinary sense of the word, but he wages a constant struggle against those capitalists, who, in spite of all possible laws, are the greatest usurers in the world, and he does infinitely more good with the stolen than all London benevolent societies together." "A remarkable man," said Charlie Brand thoughtfully. There was a knock and the old valet Fred entered, offering his master a business card on a silver tray. A look of joy appeared on the Lord's face. "Bring the lady here," he said. "And you, Charlie, leave me alone now. I am unable to study with you tonight." Charlie Brand stood up, shook his friend's hand and said goodbye. When he had left the room, a veiled young lady entered. "Miss Walton, I'm glad to see you." The Lord greeted the young girl with outstretched hands. Gallantly he pressed a kiss to her small white hand, then he said, "I took the liberty of writing to you. I had to see you again, and I am immensely pleased that you have come." "I owe you many thanks," she replied simply. Then she drew back her veil and showed a wonderful little face, from which two great blue children's eyes looked at the young lord. A rare contrast to this was the blue-black hair. Lord Lister offered her a seat and sat opposite her. "I need your help," she said, her beautiful eyes filling with tears. "My mother is seriously ill and her last properties have been sold. I've tried every way to get a job. You know how it went for me in my last job. And as with Brown it went everywhere, so that I am now without any merit." "Poor kid," whispered Lord Lister, "I know such wretches who had to be flogged. But let us rather let this unsavory subject rest. I have written to you because tomorrow I am going on a journey for a few months, my dear lady, and it would be my pleasure if you would copy a great work for me during that time. On this you have work for a few months, which you can do in your own house, so that you can nurse your sick mother at the same time." He went to a bookcase and took 5 thick books of world history from it. "My servant will deliver it to you this evening, and I beg you, since I am going on an indefinite journey, to accept this money as an advance on your fee." He took out a wallet from his breast pocket, took an envelope, and put in it some banknotes. Then he closed the envelope and handed it to the young girl with a courteous bow. She wanted to kiss his hand, but he hastily withdrew it and said in a steady tone, "No, ma'am, you can't. Go home to nurse your mother. If the fee may seem particularly high to you, I hereby inform you that I am always accustomed to giving good salaries." A servant entered. "The Scotland Yard Police Commissioner," he announced. "Baxter?" asked Miss Walton, with an expression of terror on the fair face. Lord Lister looked at her in surprise. "What's the matter, Miss Walton?" Trembling, she answered, "Allow me to leave this house before that man sees me. He is a kinsman of mine, a cold, selfish man, who showed me the door when I came begging him for help for my mother." "A decent man," replied Lord Lister, scornfully. Then he noticed that Miss Walton's eyes had filled with tears. He approached her with a friendly smile and gently stroked her hair. A comfortable feeling flooded through the young girl. Lord Lister no longer seemed like a stranger to her. "How shall I thank you?" she whispered, and her eyes looked at him lovingly. He felt that she would have willingly granted all his wishes. For a moment the desire came to him to take the beautiful young girl in his arms and kiss her red lips. Such a man, he had every right to it. For a few seconds they looked deeply into each other's eyes, and close bonds of love were formed between them. But Lord Lister soon regained all self-control. He leaned forward and pressed a soft kiss to the beautiful girl's forehead. Then he spoke. "Go home now, Miss Helene, I may need your help some day." He shook the girl's hand, scolded the valet, and told this Miss Walton to take this Miss Walton out of the house down a side corridor. His countenance grew serious. He sat down in his armchair and lit a cigarette. When he had made a few moves, he scolded the servant again, clamped his monocle in his eye, and waited indifferently for the arrival of Commissioner Baxter of Scotland Yard. Chapter 5. The Burglary. "I come to protect you," said the Commissioner, as he faced Lord Lister. A sneer played on the gentleman's lips as he asked, "To protect me? That's very interesting. I truly did not know that I needed protection. Am I perhaps looking forward to that?" He stretched his finely built, athletic frame, which was well above that of the policeman. "It's not for your personal protection either. I understand that. I wouldn't advise anyone to fight me. I have won several awards in boxing and wrestling and am known in my club as the best fighter and shooter. I'll shoot you half a penny between your thumb and forefinger. I already told you that it is not about your person, but about your possessions." Lister pointed to his safe. "My property is excellently preserved there. But for all that, a dangerous London burglar will visit you today to try and rob your property." Lord Lister laughed loudly. "That's funny. How do you know they want to break into my house?" "Scotland Yard hears and knows everything. We are known as the most famous detectives in the world." "Definitely. laughed Lord Lister with light mockery. Baxter noticed. In a somewhat nervous tone he said, "Your lordship seems to look upon our profession with a little disrespect since our last failure with that unknown Raffles." "Certainly," replied the questioner, "no one can claim that you behaved very gloriously in doing so, I admit it, but we have a special burglar here too, and miraculously, our genius Sherlock Holmes does not help us in this battle against the unknown. He would probably have rendered that rogue harmless long ago." Lord Lister blew the puffs of smoke before him, and after a while said, "To return to our case, the burglar, who, as you claim, wishes to pay me a visit tonight, would do a good job, since I just yesterday made £20,000 sterling on stock market speculation, and this money has not yet been put to the bank paid off. One half is there in the safe, the other half is hidden in my bedroom under my bed." "Very sensible," said Baxter, "but it is quite possible that the thief will take everything away." "All right, too," claimed the master of the house in an indifferent tone, "I have insurance against burglary and theft, so don't worry about anything. I will be reimbursed for all damage. To me and Scotland Yard the arrest of the thief is of the utmost importance, and I beg you to permit me and my officers to guard your house this night." "Excellent," nodded the lord, "my house is at your service. It is now 7:15. At 8 o'clock I have an appointment with a friend. My valet will supply you with everything you need. Perhaps you also know Mr. Baxter. What kind of burglar is that who wants to rob me?" "Certainly, it is the famous Raffles." "Raffles? All devilish. I would like to get to know this fellow. I will write to my friend that I am unable to attend tonight and I will keep you company. Perhaps together we will succeed in making the burglar harmless at last." "Excellent," replied Baxter. "At least when he comes," asserted the lord. "I'm going straight to the theatre in my car to tell my friend personally that I'm not free tonight. I'll be back here at 10. "And I will warn my officers," said Baxter. He still saw Lord Lister go to his bedroom and take a fur coat from an armchair there. Then the commissioner left the room. In the vestibule waited 4 officers, the same ones with whom he had visited the banker Gordon at that time. They deliberated that he should stay that night in Lord Lister's study. 2 of the men stationed themselves in the vestibule, 1 in front of the house, the 4th in one of the upper rooms. In this way the villa was very closely guarded. The inspector now called the valet and went with him to the study. Lord Lister must have left it by now, as the electric lights in both rooms had already been turned off. The detective turned the light back on. The 2 men stood close to the mantelpiece and now went to search the bedroom. A wide sliding door, which rolled into the wall in 2 directions, separated the bedroom and study. In the former there was only a small window, covered by iron bars. From here a small door led to the bathroom on the left. Neither bedroom nor bathroom had another exit and could therefore only be reached from the study. The detective checked everything again, lifted the covers, opened cupboards and doors, and took out the clothes to make sure no one had sneaked in. The valet was delighted with all these precautions, and he could not resist the remark, "I do believe that you pick up every speck of dust." "I believe so," replied Baxter, with a proud gesture. "Not even a flea escapes us." "Do you want anything else?" asked the servant, and when the detective replied in the negative, he left the study. The detective sat down in the armchair by the fire and began to read the evening paper. It took him about an hour to do this, then put the newspaper aside, took from his pocket an electric safety lantern, made sure it was all right, and set it on the mantelpiece. Then he examined his pistol and put the weapon in the right coat pocket for immediate hand. The house was dead silent and not a sound betrayed the detective's presence. In deep darkness the den yawned, but soon Baxter's eyes became accustomed to the darkness and began to dimly to distinguish the objects. The steady pendulum swing of the great clock was the only sound heard. This clock stood against the wall behind which, next to the bedroom, lay the bathroom. With a heavy blow the clock now announced the 10th hour. But what was that? Baxter listened with bated breath. When the clock stopped chiming, the detective from the bedroom heard a soft sound, as if a tuning fork was beating on steel. The detective's gaze pierced the darkness, and then he saw the faint outline of a figure beside the bed. For a moment his pulse stopped, his thoughts worked as lightning. He believed in delusion at first. After all, it was impossible that someone could have broken into the bedroom. He had examined everything. Now he heard another sound, as if an iron object had been forcibly broken open. In an instant the detective had pulled out his pistol and turned on the electric light. At what he now saw, his eyes sparkled with joy. Finally got it, flashed his brain. In the bedroom, near the broken open money chest, he saw a man in a neat evening toilet, the cylinder on his head, a black mask over his face. "Stop!" cried Baxter in a commanding tone, "or I shoot." But the masked man also raised his revolver, so that Baxter was forced to put out the lantern to avoid the bullet. In the same instant he fired. He hadn't hit, because now something unexpected happened. The masked man leapt to the sliding door and closed it before the detective could stop it. Alerted by the gunshots, the detectives now burst into the room. Baxter lit up again. "We have him, at last we have the infamous Raffles," he exclaimed. "In there he's trapped like a mouse. Watch out, men, the revolver ready. Forward." He rushed to the sliding door, the detectives followed. The door was pushed open. For a moment all hesitated. The room lay shrouded in darkness, and nothing to be seen but the open iron money chest. The police officers searched the bed, opened the closets, no one was found. "He'll be in the bathroom," exclaimed Detective Mahome, trying to open the door. His assumption turned out to be correct. The door was locked on the inside with an iron bolt, which they now tried to force with united forces. At first, with great difficulty, the door gave in. While the detectives in their zeal now paid no attention to anything else, the door of the great old Dutch clock in the study was suddenly opened and the masked man emerged from it. The piece of furniture stood against the wall of the bathroom and had an artfully arranged secret door. The clock had an entrance from the bathroom, which was hidden by the sliding door when it was open. For a moment the masked man looked round the corner at the detectives, then with a jerk he tossed the sliding doors shut and bolted them shut. Thus he was completely safe from the policeman. With icy calm he now went to the safe, which he opened with a secret key, took a package, and in the next instant was gone from the room. This happened at the very moment when the detectives, after desperate efforts, finally broke open the door. When they rushed into the room, in spite of their great excitement they stood for a moment as if dumbfounded. The door of the safe was wide open and its interior looked black and empty. "All devilish," grunted Baxter, "that's magic, the safe is empty. But we must catch him," ordered the inspector, and he flew to the door of the room. The detectives ran after him. But when he opened the door, he found himself facing Lord Lister and his friend Charlie Brand. "Hello!" cried the gentleman. "Good evening, gentlemen. Whither so hastily, Mr. Baxter?" "Have you seen Raffles?" exclaimed this one. "I? No," laughed the lord, "I have just come from the club to help you catch. But have you perhaps seen him?" "Your lordship mocks me," exclaimed the inspector. "All kidding aside, I did see him. He was in your bedroom and robbed your cashier." "And further?" the lord asked calmly. "Did you let him escape then?" Baxter didn't answer, but instead spoke the cockroach. "Yes, your lordship, we were courteous enough to let him escape with the aid of the inspector of police." "Shut up!" shouted Baxter furiously. "That man has made an alliance with the devil. He cannot be caught. He fled through that room despite all precautions and close surveillance. When I discovered him, he slammed that sliding door shut, and when I was in the room with my detectives, trying to open the door to the bathroom, I found that he was in that room and that he had bolted the door." "A wonderful person," laughed Lord Lister. "So he took a bath?" "Not, your lordship," said Detective Mahome, "but it seems as if he came here through the pipe of the water pipe, for while we searched the empty bathtub, he very calmly opened the safe here and stole everything." That man is still driving me to the insane asylum. Backed Baxter. Lord Lister gave him a sneer as his secretary entered. To these he explained in short words what had happened, and then handed him the company's policy against theft and burglary, which he carried in his wallet. "Early tomorrow you can collect the amount for me," he said in a very calm tone. "And now, my lords, I advise you to leave the matter to me when Raffles makes another announcement of his plans. For to let a thief steal and escape, as thou hast done, I can." With a shy gesture, Baxter said goodbye and left the house with his men. Lord Lister laughed heartily and said to his friend Charlie, "Tomorrow we are going to Berlin. I want to visit an old friend of mine there." "Yes, but," replied Charlie, "I don't understand. Did you really have £20,000 in your safe?" "No," replied his friend calmly, "just a few packets of unpaid bills." Thought Charlie Brand, and his face took on a curious expression. "I don't understand it yet." "Well, my dear boy," exclaimed Lord Lister, "don't you understand that those unpaid bills which the police had stolen by a certain unknown to you Raffles, are being paid by the insurance company with £20,000 on account of this theft? There might as well have been nothing at all in the safe. The main thing is that Baxter and the detectives must swear that so much has been stolen from me, and that society has to pay. After all, she had no reason to exist otherwise." "All devils." Charlie Brand supported, "That is a famous idea. But how do you get this, Raffles?" Lord Lister took a cigarette and lit it. Then he blew a great circle into the air, and said, with a smile twisting the corners of his mouth, "Yes, my dear boy, you need not know that now. It is enough for me that you are my good, faithful Charlie, who fortunately understands no more than what he must understand. But Raffles, my boy, Raffles, that is my ideal." Chapter 6. At Black Jacket. Banker James Gordon had closed his office after the policeman had left him and was walking down Oxford Street towards the Tower. On the way he took an electric tram that took him to Tower Bridge. Here, where the proud tower lies, is a part of the city whose inhabitants are the most feared and dangerous criminals in London. A great multitude of small streets and alleys with old-fashioned facades, pubs and shops, was the refuge of the rabble of the English capital. In one of these streets lived Mr. Govan, an Irish moneylender, known to the police as Black Jack. Street Ermandad thought him one of the most cunning healers in the capital, yet it had never been possible to find stolen goods from him. Black Jack masterfully mastered the art of hiding everything that was dangerous. It was said of him that he owned several houses of his own and was a shareholder in a large business. His shop was stocked with all manner of articles, barrels of ship's biscuits, silken American bacon, bars of raw gold, clothes, furniture, and chests, and also filled the small space that only a narrow passage remained open to the filthy counter, behind which Black Jack served his customers from morning to midnight. Banker Gordon and Black Jack greeted each other like two old friends. Innumerable dirty business had been traded between the two men of honor over the years. The pawnbroker closed the shop door from behind his counter by means of a secret spring. He did this every time his friend James Gordon came to him on business. Protecting himself from unexpected visitors, he offered the banker a cigar. Gordon took a few puffs and then turned to Black Jack to tell him the story of the surprise by the genius Raffles. Anger and hatred sparkled from the banker's eyes. With clenched fists he cried, "I must have my property back today. That ruffian of a Raffles will know who he is dealing with." The other scratched his head once. Then, after much thought, he said, "For the devil. I've always had a lot of confidence in our business, and you know I don't make a conscience out of helping anyone into the other world. But now, I don't know, James, but you choose an adversary against whom no one has yet stood, and besides, who is he anyway?" The banker leaned into his friend's ear and whispered, "Lord Lister." The other let out a cry of surprise and asked, "How do you know that?" Gordon produced a letter and handed him Black Jack. This one read the inscription, "Mr. Lyon, Strand 2, London, by express delivery. "That's your secret bureau," said the pawnbroker. "So it is," replied the banker. "It happened before I came here to see what had arrived in the mail, and I found this letter. Read it." Jack flew through the contents of the letter, which read: "Dear Sir, on behalf of banker James Gordon, I must repay you your deposits with interest. I request you to visit me this evening. Lord Edward Lister, Regent Park." "I don't understand that," said Jack, shaking his head. "But exclaimed James Gordon, "listen. Raffles took all my bills of exchange and papers of value, as well as my cash book. He had the addresses copied from the latter and wrote to the people to return the bills stolen from me. Under the name Lyon I have secret relations with the English bank. Raffles does not know this, of course, and he believed that Lyon was also one of my clients. That is why he wrote this letter, so that it is clear to me that Lord Edward Lister and Raffles are one and the same person." "Drums!" cried the pawnbroker, "that's the boldest piece I ever heard of." "Who do you have on hand?" asked Gordon. "I need 2 good-natured burglars to come with me to this villain tonight, and try to get my property back before he gives it all away." "I don't understand," muttered Jack, "that fellow must be mad to steal just for the pleasure of other people. But I'll get you 2 of my best men at once." He took the stopper of a lead pipe which led into the bottom, shouted a few words through the opening, and listened intently. After a while, like from afar, 3 dull sounds resounded. "They will come in a moment," said Jack to his dignified friend, closing the wondrous telephone again. A few minutes passed. Then a soft knock was heard in an old cupboard leaning against one of the walls. Jack got up at once, closed the old-fashioned door of the cabinet, and through the clothes that hung in the closet 2 chaps crawled out with dangerous faces, eyeing the banker suspiciously. Jack first rearranged the clothes in the closet, then closed the door firmly and said to Gordon, "This is my secret exit to the cellar. He has already saved many from the gallows if Scotland Yard was so close to him that no one would have given a penny more for his life." Then he said to the 2 criminals, "Guys, there's work for you guys." "All right," replied the larger of the pair, whose face had been severely disfigured by a knife cut that cut half his nose away. He was known by the burglar's name the Pig. His ally was a dangerous criminal called Harfor. Govan, such was the proper name of Black Jack, took a few more puffs on his cigar and said, "You must crack a safe with this gentleman. Get the necessary tools out of the shed." "So," laughed the Pig in his groggy voice, "but first tell me what there is to inherit. Will we also get lucky or will he be alone?" "The contents are for this gentleman alone, everything is his property." "What we don't know," growled Harfor, "if we crack a safe and a court, we go to jail. I think we should have some money too." "You will too," reassured the pawnbroker, and then to the banker, "How much do they get for their work?" "I think £10 is enough." The Pig let out a long whistle. Then he exclaimed, £10? I won't open the front door to that just yet. Strike, £100. The banker drummed his fingers nervously on the dirty counter. "Well, give breath," said Half Ear. "I don't intend to catch a cold in that damned journey here." "I don't believe," claimed Jack, "that the price is too high for the boys. They are putting their freedom on the line." "And we might get some blue beans too," finished the Pig. "That gentleman doesn't seem to know anything about business." "It's all right," the banker finally agreed. "And money with the fish," Harfor commanded with a cheeky gesture. Reluctantly, the banker took out a wallet and paid the requested money. The 2 scoundrels held the banknotes suspiciously up to the light before dropping them into their pockets, nodding in satisfaction and grunting, "All right." Then they gave the banker a jovial hand and left with him. They fetched their burglar tools from an attic room on the Thames, then took a rental car and drove through the streets of London to Regent Park. Near the house they got out of the cab and crept around the villa to see which way they could best enter. Despite their keen sniffing around, they did not notice that 2 men were crouching behind the undergrowth in the garden, Detective Mahome and Sergeant Tyler. Baxter had left the pair there and ordered them to keep a close watch on the house, as, in his opinion, Raffles could not have left the villa yet. The policeman watched with great interest the three burglars at their work. The cockroach rubbed his hands in delight and whispered to the sergeant, "We also have more luck than wisdom. All Devil's Fellow will be promoted tomorrow. If I'm not mistaken, that's where the banker we're looking for climbs in." "That is impossible." Sergeant Tyler watched closely. A few moments later he nodded his head. "You're right, Mahome, I'm putting £10 against a penny, that's James Gordon." "Certainly and firmly," whispered the detective, "and now you'll understand too, Tyler, why that fellow, although he was undoubtedly robbed by Raffles, wanted nothing to do with us. He was afraid we were going to find out about his tricks." "Certainly," replied Tyler, "that is clear to me now." "Look, now they're in," Mahome interrupted. "They should know that the safe is empty. Now run quickly to the nearest telephone, at the 5th lantern yonder, and call Scotland Yard." "All right, sir." The detective had already disappeared in the direction indicated. 15 minutes passed before Tyler returned. Now both crept into the house by the same route the burglars had taken. Avoiding all possible noise as much as possible, they reached Lord Lister's study and bedroom. As they were about to enter the study, they heard a loud voice, "Stop, or I'll shoot." A savage roar followed by several shots. They forced their way into the study, but in the instant, when they slammed open the door, they ran into the fleeing burglars. Detective Mahome grabbed hold of the pig and gave him a few lightning strikes with the flat of his hand to the temple, causing the intruder to fall stunned. In the meantime, Harfor succeeded in opening the window and jumping out. "Good evening, gentlemen," came now from the mouth of Lord Lister, who stood in the middle of the room, dressed in a housecoat. "You see that they wanted to rob me for the second time." At these words he had turned on the electric light, and by its glow those present saw James Gordon crouching by the safe. Tyler grabbed him and handcuffed him. The trembling usurer cast a glance full of anger and hatred at the detective and Lord Lister. Thereupon an expression of infernal joy came upon his face, and pointing to Lord Lister, he cried to the detectives, "Gentlemen, thou hast made a good catch there." "Certainly," laughed Mahome, still holding on to the pig tightly. "We have been looking for this boy for a long time. He has at least 20 years too good." "No," exclaimed James Gordon, "I don't mean him, but that gentleman." He pointed to Lord Lister. "There stands Raffles." "Crazy man," laughed Tyler. And Mahome thought, "You want to keep yourself mad, don't you?" "No, sir, we know such regions, we do not fly into them." "I charge you, gentlemen," shrieked the handcuffed banker again, trembling at all the limbs, "take that man prisoner. I assure you, he is Raffles." "Be silent," Tyler snapped, "don't offend the person of his lordship." At this moment a patrol from Scotland Yard halted in front of the house. Orders rang out, and in a few moments the house was filled with detectives. After a short conversation between Detective Mahome and Inspector Baxter, the latter gave orders to take the banker to Scotland Yard. Again the usurer repeated his accusation against Lord Lister, and implored the inspector to believe his words. When he finally saw that no one believed his words, he began to rage and curse like a madman. Desperately, he threw his arms around himself, yelling over and over, "There stands Raffles. There's Raffles. Carry him away," ordered Baxter curtly, "he wants us to believe he is mad." 4 strong fists grabbed him and led Gordon out of the room. The detectives followed. In the garden they found Harfor, who had broken both legs in the jump and lay groaning in a bush. As Detective Mahome got into the patrol car last of all, he saw from a brightly lit window on the top floor the sharp profile of Lord Lister, who, as he watched them, stood smoking a cigarette. Chapter 7. In Scotland Yard. It was about 10 o'clock the next morning when a representative of the Burglary and Theft Insurance Company appeared before Inspector Baxter to inquire about the burglary of Lord Lister. "It is incomprehensible, sir," declared the latter. "This Raffles is fooling me and the whole world. Before my very eyes he committed the theft." "Unbelievable," replied the representative, shaking his head. "It would be considered impossible if you did not tell me yourself. Have you seen for yourself the money that was stolen from the Lord?" "Yes," confirmed the inspector, "I have convinced myself with my own eyes that it was there." "A desperate matter, then we have nothing left but to pay." "You must certainly do that," said Baxter firmly. "Then be so kind as to sign this declaration for my company." At these words the officer of the company took a piece from his wallet, which he presented to the inspector for signature, declaring that the amount of the stolen sum was £20,000. Without hesitation, Baxter put his name under it. The representative then said goodbye. Now the inspector summoned the imprisoned banker Gordon and his accomplices. The detectives also gathered in the office of their inspector and the prisoners were brought in. After the necessary formalities had been complied with, the interrogation began. James Gordon, realizing that there was no way he could escape prison, now assumed the attitude of a fox that has fallen into a trap and is determined to bite off the clenched paw. So he began to tell the inspector and the detectives what had moved him to commit the burglary on Lord Lister, and what had moved him not to tell anything of Raffles' theft. As proof he showed the letter from Lord Lister, the same one he had let his friend Govan read. Great excitement overcame the police officers. It became clear to them that they had faced the great unknown, the genius Raffles, and that they had only had to step in to make the best catch the officers of Scotland Yard could ever make. "Why didn't you say this before?" exclaimed Baxter. "You know there is a £1,000 reward for the capture of Raffles." "I have told you many times, but no one would believe me," replied James Gordon. "It's to go crazy," roared the inspector, pacing to and fro in his desk. Suddenly he controlled his anger and ordered, "Forward. Let's bring along quite a few of our best detectives. He won't escape us now. We will surround the fox den. Today the Lord must fall into our hands." "Let's hope for the best," said Mahome. "I believe, however, that the cave will be empty when we get there. It would also be a shame if it fell into our hands. We can have many more interesting adventures with him. I am beginning to take pleasure in that man, and there is a great deal to be learned from him." Baxter screamed furiously. "Shut up. How hast thou the courage to admire a rogue? You are utterly unfit for the profession of detective." "I doubt that," replied Mahome, laughing sarcastically, "for recently you have said very flattering things to me." "Let us waste no time," urged Tyler. "It's time we got Raffles." The detectives were now preparing to leave Scotland Yard. On the way, Mahome spoke to Baxter. "You doubt whether I am a good detective, but I wanted to make a small remark to you. An hour ago a representative of the insurance company came to see you. I think it would be useful to warn that company not to pay the sum insured for the time being to Lord Lister, alias Raffles." "Drums!" exclaimed Baxter, rushing back to Scotland Yard. "You're right, I almost forgot. I'll phone right away." Detective Mahome accompanied him to the telephone, and in the next instant Baxter had gained an experience, for he learned that Raffles was faster than him and that the amount had already been paid. Nervously, the inspector, along with Mahome, returned to the waiting detectives and the car flew toward Regent Park. Lord Lister in the meantime, not thinking of the danger which threatened him, was in his study and busy packing a large suitcase. He had had some clothes laid there by his valet when Charlie Brand entered. While the latter laid down his coat and hat, his friend looked thoughtfully at the trunk. After a few moments Lister spoke to himself. "I won't let the case be packed any further, it would be foolish to take it with me." His secretary, hearing these words, said, "But you need him on a journey, you can't travel without clothes." "Why not?" replied Lord Lister, "it would be nothing but ballast. I can get everything I need for money everywhere. Apropos, It took quite a long time with that insurance company. Did the gentleman object? Not that, replied Charlie Brand. But they sent one of their officers to Scotland Yard to get information from Inspector Baxter. These were in accordance with my statements, and I was then paid the insured amount with a sour face. Well, laughed Lord Lister, the gentleman would rather receive than pay, in fact theft. Where have you got the money? Here's the amount. At these words Charlie took from his pocket a package containing 20 banknotes, each of £1,000. Lord Lister took the money, counted it, and put it carefully in his wallet. An ironic smile played on his finely cut lips. So, he said, this affair was worth the effort. Now that unknown Raffles could really come and steal a good amount from me. A power. Remarked his secretary, it is really necessary for the wealthy to insure themselves against theft. Laughing, his friend patted him on the shoulder. Charlie, he said, what if one owns nothing? Then you don't need to insure yourself, of course. Very well. Laughed Lord Lister, that's an opinion too. But I, for instance, I have taken out insurance in case I should once again come into possession of money. If this were stolen from me, I would at least be covered. The other coughed. You always have your own philosophies, you remind me of Sherlock Holmes. The main thing is that you now have enough money for a European trip. I'll think it over, replied Lord Lister, my hunch tells me I won't make it to the mainland for a while. I believe there is still work for me here and I think London is a city with more to experience than in the whole world. At this moment the valet entered and said, Your Lordship. Outside there is a man who looks very untrustworthy. Well, certainly a police officer, joked the Lord. No, replied the valet, I don't think so, he looks too ragged and dirty for that. Let him wait a little while. The servant bowed and left the room. Lord Lister thought for a moment and then said to Charlie Brand. Look, my boy, drive to Victoria Station and wait for me there at the newsstand. If I don't have to change my schedule, we'll take the next train to the harbour. Why can't I wait here for you? Asked Charlie. We can drive to the station together, can't we? Lord Lister looked earnestly in the eye of his young friend and said, Charlie, do you remember how you came to me 6 months ago? We had met 2 years before and you told me that for you, if no rescue showed up, there was nothing left but a gunshot. I then took your weapon from you and made it clear to you that honor debts are quite different from light gambling debts, and that the gentlemen who had played with you in frack and tuxedo were no better than state-protected impostors. I also proved to you that a human life is a precious thing and that it can only be destroyed once. After all these expositions you have come to see in me your older, more experienced friend and you have joined me. You are some years younger than me, and now that you have been with me for half a year I consider you a tried comrade, therefore I don't want to keep a secret from you any more. He took a few long drags on his cigarette and continued. Look, Charlie, the money I voluntarily gave you for your sustenance, and the sums I use for myself, as well as the alms I gave to so many unfortunates, all come from the same inexhaustible capital, my brain. Lord Lister paused and lit another cigarette, while Charlie Brand watched him with interest. I don't quite understand you, he said after a while. You said, Edward, that you earn a fortune with your brain. However, I never see you working. Would you like to tell me how you get those riches? Oh yes, replied his friend, knocking the ashes off his cigarette. Then he looked at Charlie again and, coming close to him, answered. I'm Raffles. The young man stared at him, as if envisioning a ghost. Are you kidding me, Edward? He asked in a hesitant tone. Not at all, replied Lord Lister. For a year I have been the person who, under the pseudonym Raffles, avenges the needy on the wealthy. So is it really you? Asked Charlie, still doubting his words. On my honor, confirmed Lord Lister. I'm Raffles. But how could you? I can't understand yet. It sounds like a fairy tale. How did you get there? Quite simply, was the reply. My father and mother were ruined by one of those eminent, rogue London stockbrokers, so that I suffered poverty in my youth. My father therefore took his own life, while that rich wretch still rides today in his crew with 4 horses through London and owns a castle in Scotland. He owes all his wealth to the money he stole from my parents. Unfortunately, the law could not protect my father from this villain. And afterwards I got to know a great many other stock thieves and such swindlers. Hundreds of thousands have to toil every day for them to help them, to increase their wealth, and receive as wages too little to live and too much to die, while their leeches enjoy the richness of the earth in luxury. Then I felt compelled to go and avenge that great multitude, to fight against the brood. I give back to the poor devils what I stole from them with a gentle hand, and now I ask you, Charlie, will you help me in this hard struggle? Or do you not feel the strength for that in you? Tell me honestly and candidly. You know that I love truth above all. Without hesitation, the young man took the hand that had been offered to him, held it tight, and said, "Yes, Edward. Nothing holds me back. Whatever it is, I will stand by you and do all that you see fit." "All right." The Lord nodded. "I knew it. And now listen. On your way to Victoria Station you will pass the Salvation Army. Give there an anonymous donation of £5,000. He took the money received from Charlie from his breast pocket and handed it to him. "Furthermore," he continued, "take £5,000 and hand it over to the administration of the Foundling Home. Keep the rest of the money for me. You may not mention my name anywhere, nor do I require a receipt. And now go, my boy, and wait for me, as I have agreed with you." Charlie put the money with her, they once more shook hands, and the grand thief's new helper left the room. Lord Lister watched him for a few moments, then called his valet and ordered him to let the waiter in. A rather ragged individual entered the room. Without waiting for it to be offered to him, the unknown visitor took a seat, began filling his pipe with tobacco and lit it. After making some tugging, he cleared his throat and spat unabashedly on the precious carpet. Lord Lister looked at him with his hands in the pockets of his trousers. "You are not in your own house, my friend," he said at last, "and it is not a pub here either." "I know," said the stranger curtly, in a voice hoarse with gin. "Nice," remarked Lord Lister. "I am surprised that you mistake my carpet for cobblestones. What is the reason for your coming?" "Business," was the reply. "Affairs?" repeated John Raffles. "I do not know what I have to do with you." "You'll hear that in a minute. Listen up. My name is Pit Tom, and I'm known for being devilishly clever with my knife. I know exactly how to hit the spot between the 3rd and 4th ribs. No one can improve me on that. Shall I prove it to you?" He jumped up and put his right hand in his trouser pocket, as if to take a knife out of it. Lord Lister stood motionless. "I am of no use to you," he said contemptuously. "So," replied the stranger, "I just wanted to introduce myself to you." "Surely you have already been seated?" the Lord asked suddenly. The questioner looked at him in astonishment and replied, "I? How would you lie to that?" Lister laughed. "Don't be so big, I know full well that you've had a few years. If you know, don't ask me any more. But I was innocent. Such a thing can happen to any decent person. I am as innocent as a newborn child. They have not been able to prove anything to me." "Good, then that's done, and now tell me quickly what you want with me." I'll explain briefly. I had no shelter last night and went to spend the night in an old barn on Tower Street. When I was about to turn up again, I noticed that some men had come in, looking for something there. They were burglars, I believe, and they called your name." "Oh, so you wanted to come and tell me that those men intended to break into my house. I wish them good luck, and to reward your efforts I will give you £10. The intruder smoked calmly and, before opening his mouth, spat back on the carpet. "I did not come here to earn £10. I think my further statements, which concern your own person, are worth to you at least £5,000. The Lord laughed heartily, without answering a word. "I think," continued the stranger, "it is a pleasure to spend £5,000 on a tidings worth 50,000, especially when one is as rich as you are. I believe, too, that you may be reasoned with if I tell you that I know things about a certain Raffles, who called you. I don't care at all, was the calm reply. I don't pay spy services, so keep your messages to yourself and leave my room now. The man got up calmly, emptied his pipe into an ashtray, put it in his pocket and took out a bottle of gin. Eagerly he put it to his mouth and took a long gulp, then he handed the bottle to Lord Lister, but he refused with a wave of his hand and said, "Drink your gin yourself, I'm used to using my own." The uninvited guest closed the bottle again and put it with him, thereupon he muttered, "You are not a gentleman, otherwise you would have a drink with a colleague." Lord Lister laughed again, the frankness of this lost subject amused him. "Thank you for the compliment," he replied, "but I thank you for the honor." An expression of great hatred appeared in the eyes of the stranger. He understood that he was no match for John Raffles, that the latter even mocked him. "For the devil," he cursed, "go to hell, fine bum. But the devil may get me too, if I let you bluff me. Your glacé gloves and frock coat don't impress me. But now I ask you for the last time, will you give me £5,000 or not?" With a simple no, pointed Lord Lister to the door. "All right," said the stranger, "then we will talk to each other in a different way." With lightning speed he drew a broad dagger from his coat and with a tiger-like leap he approached Raffles. But he had expected the attack. With a swift arm movement he prevented the stabbing of the assassin, and in the next instant seized his coat and, applying the Japanese art of wrestling, drew his sleeves over his arms on both sides, leaving the man quite defenseless. In the next instant the Lord carried him like a feather to the door, opened it, and threw the man out. Cursing and cursing, the criminal rushed down the stairs and out of the house. Lord Lister, however, called his valet. "Listen, Fred," he said calmly, "I am going on a long journey, and beseech you, while I am away, to keep watch over the house, until I send you word what will happen next." "All right," replied the servant with a bow. "Does your lordship wish the coffers to be packed?" "No, thank you, I'm traveling without luggage." Fred bowed again, when at the same instant the bell rang. They both listened for a moment, whereupon the valet asked, "Does your lordship still receive visitors?" "Yes," replied his lord, and Fred left the room to open the door. After a few minutes Miss Walton entered with a large bouquet of flowers. "Forgive me for coming to you, my lord," said the young girl in her sweet, soft voice. "Offer you some flowers as thanks from my mother and me, before you go on your journey." With a friendly smile she offered him a beautiful bouquet. "Flowers?" asked John Raffles, stirred. "To me they are the most beautiful thing in the world." "Oh, I love it so much too," said Miss Walton, confused. "A flower," continued Lord Lister, "always reminds me of a beautiful woman." He gazed with admiration at the blushing face of its listener and at her beautiful dark eyes. He completely forgot that he was about to leave his house, and that every moment a great danger threatened him, of which his instincts had already warned him. Gallantly he led Miss Walton to the armchair by the fireplace. "I don't want to keep you long," said the young lady hesitantly. "I see you are packing your suitcase and don't want to disturb you. Oh, how delightful traveling must be. I have always longed to make a great journey, if I could, to the south, to Italy." "Have you never been outside London?" asked Raffles. "No, never, I've never even seen the sea. We were too poor for that." "What was your father, if I may ask?" "Sea officer. He drowned in the high seas by an unfortunate accident. Ah, we cannot even visit his grave, he lies at the bottom of the sea. My mother received a small pension, but because of the poor woman's illness for many years, we had to take out so much money that we were completely behind." "And your kinsman, that Police Inspector Baxter, is he aware of your circumstances?" "Certainly," replied Miss Walton, "for we have asked him for help more than once." "A dear kinsman." It sounded with a scornful laugh. "How is he related to you?" "He is my mother's stepbrother. I already told you how hard-hearted he is. He is no better or worse than all egoists, and I hope one day I may reward him for what he has done for you." A knock at the door was heard, the old valet entered and reported, Your lordship, the police officers, who were already here last night, are here again. Lord Lister thought for a moment, took another cigarette, lit it, and laughed aloud. I believe, he said, that the gentlemen here have forgotten something. Forget something? Asked Fred, looking around the room inquiringly. Yes, my old friend, laughed Raffles, for they have forgotten to bring the rogue they were looking for. Is he still here then? The man looked around again with a silly face. The Lord laughed and slapped him on the shoulder as he spoke in a confidential tone. He's still here, Fred, but I don't think they'll be successful in catching him. Then he went to the window and looked out into the street. He whistled softly when he saw a dozen uniformed police officers who were just encircling the house. The fox hunt is on, he muttered, let them try their luck. Then he turned again to the servant. Listen carefully, Fred, to what I say. This lady is my secretary. I have given her the trunk. Miss Walton will leave my house with it, and you must arrange for a carriage to take the lady and her luggage to the station. Tell the gentleman that I must have a short interview with my secretary, and that they must be patient for another minute. Very well, your lordship. The servant went. Scarcely had the door been closed when Lord Lister went up to Miss Walton and took her hands. Now the time has come, Miss Helene, when you can help me. I robbed James Gordon yesterday of a multitude of bills and IOUs. I believe that man betrayed me to the police. You are a noble man, Lord Lister, you have done my mother a great service, said the young girl, and I am happy to help you. You need all your composure, Miss Helene, one little mistake and I'm lost. No, Lord Lister, you can count on me completely, women are good allies. Lord Lister took her hand and kissed it. Again there was a knock at the door of the room, and Baxter's rough voice rang out. Open, Lord Edward Lister, in the name of the law, open. Immediately, answered the called. He leaned forward and whispered. There's a suitcase big enough to hide me, I'll hide in it to flee. You must take the trunk to Victoria Station and open it again in the compartment first, there we meet again. Here you have money, you can pay for everything you need. If the police officers question you, say that you intend to travel and that the briefcase belongs to you. Have you understood me, Miss Walton? Secure, replied the trembling girl, but John Raffles saw that the girl's fresh face was covered with a nervous pallor. Be good, he whispered. I will. Lord Lister rushed to the trunk, but before he could open it the door of the room opened and Baxter, Tyler, Mahome, and 2 other detectives burst into the room. Raffles was cut off the last way to rescue. But he faced the detectives with wonderful composure. Despite all the danger, he remained in complete control of the situation. With a kind countenance he mocked. Good day, gentlemen. What gives me the honor of your visit? Is Raffles going to commit another theft? No, replied Baxter, Raffles will commit no more theft, for I pronounce you my prisoner. So, laughed the unmasked man, that's very strange, to declare Raffles a prisoner without having caught him. We have caught him, said Baxter. That's very lucky. I congratulate you. That is certainly happy. And now, Lord Lister, alias Raffles, in the name of the law I imprison you. Lord Lister looked wide-eyed at the detective inspector for a moment. Then he said, That's a precious joke. If you have any more of that sort, I advise you to become an editor of a humorous magazine. You fooled us long enough. Baxter fired up. Come, hurry. Lord Lister leaned against the mantelpiece with indifference, without the slightest sign of nervousness, and spoke with a polite smile. I pity you, Inspector Baxter. Why? I mean you have the misfortune of having to deal with me. Luckily it won't be long. Your pranks are now over. And red with rage Baxter spoke to the detectives. Makes short process. Stop, cried the Lord. You will surely afford this lady who was my secretary to leave this house. That suitcase belongs to her. Baxter looked at Miss Walton with a reluctant gesture and only now recognized her. "What are you doing in that robber's den?" he shouted to his niece. "Earning bread for my mother." "A nice way of earning bread. You certainly like that rascal." "Rogue!" thundered Lord Lister, "you will not escape your punishment for that." He took out a silver case. "Do you see this case? Good friends from St. Petersburg, nihilists, gave them to me to use in times of danger. It is a pocket bomb, filled with dynamite and always ready to use. We are now going on a great journey together, from which no one will return. Raffles will not be caught, Monsieur Inspector of Police, and Raffles will afford to take you with him." In the next instant he raised his hand to hurl the bomb at the officers. The detectives, for a moment paralyzed with terror, suddenly abandoned everything and flew out of the room. "Save yourself!" Baxter shouted now too. There the case flew onto the carpet and sprang open. It was a cigarette box. Bells and shouts rang out outside. Lord Lister, however, turned to Miss Walton. "My fate is in your hand, Miss Helene. Do everything I say." He opened the trunk, jumped in, and closed the lid. A few seconds passed. Then the door opened carefully, and through a crack Mahome peeked in. In the next moment he opened the door all the way and laughed loudly when he saw the cigarettes and the box. "Mr. Baxter, come," he exclaimed, "the dynamite has done no harm. He tricked us once again. The bomb was a cigarette box." The cockroach had great fun with the case, but Baxter raged like a madman. "The villain cannot have escaped. I'm not leaving here until I discover him in this foxhole." Furious, he drummed his fingers on the lid of the trunk. Then he asked Miss Walton, "Which way has he taken?" "I do not know. I believe he disappeared through that room. But I would like to go to my mother." She called the servant and wanted to carry the heavy suitcase with him from the room. Mahome saw that the young lady was struggling to carry her luggage, and he called to some policemen. "Carry the lady's trunk in the carriage." Miss Walton thanked him with a charming smile, and she took a deep breath as the men carried the trunk down the stairs in front of her. Meanwhile Baxter was constantly searching every nook and cranny to find Raffles, and during that time Miss Walton drove her suitcase to Victoria Station. There she had her luggage taken to a room where, as she told the servants, she intended to unpack again. No sooner was she alone than she opened the trunk, and Lord Lister, alias Raffles, leapt out safely. He stretched his body once and then turned to Miss Walton. "You are a brave girl, Miss Helene. If I were not a fugitive, I would try to see if it was not possible for me to gain more than your friendship. I hope that I can come back very soon and that you will permit me to visit you." Blushing, Miss Walton bowed her fair head as Raffles seized her hands. Moments later, he was gone. On the platform, where the train to Queenborough was waiting, he found Charlie Brand. "It's about time. The train is leaving in 5 minutes," he exclaimed. "All right, Charlie," replied Raffles, "I have to go to the telegraph office." There he sent a telegram to his valet. Then he said to Charlie Brand, "I have decided to stay in London. I want to rent a villa in West End for a while." Then he and his friend disappeared into the commotion of the crowd. Baxter, meanwhile, had had the floor broken up in the den to examine everything. Gradually he had entered the bathroom, and there he soon discovered the secret entrance to the grandfather clock in the study. At the same time he heard a soft rustle in the clock, and a triumphant smile flew across his face. "Well, the mouse is finally in the trap. We have it. His hiding place has been discovered. He's in the clock," he whispered. The police officers lined up around the clock, when suddenly the door of the clockwork opened and Detective Mahome was gripped by his colleagues. The cockroach had gone exploring on his own and had also discovered the secret entrance through which he had crawled into the clock. The police officers soon realized their mistake and released their colleague. Mahome rubbed the sore spots that had given him the detective's fists, but then he was quick to laugh at Baxter's stunned face. Before he could say anything, the fugitive's valet entered and handed the inspector a telegram. Baxter took it and read, Inspector of Detective Baxter, I congratulate you on your success. John C. Raffles. And as Baxter nearly passed out with rage, the cockroach went out of the room and laughed as he had never done in his life. The end. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. There will be more to come. Please subscribe not to miss out on what is next. I will be looking forward to your return. The music is by Madfan from Pixabay. To support this and other artists, go to pixabay.com. Sheila.